In ancient Egypt, religion wasn't just belief, it was power. The gods weren't distant figures people simply prayed to. They were built into the system itself. Every decision, every ritual, and every act of authority ran through them. The pharaoh wasn't just a ruler, he was the bridge between the divine and the world of men. His job was to maintain ma'at, which is the concept of order, balance, and stability. And if that balance broke, Egypt itself could fall into chaos. But over time, something began to shift. Power didn't leave the gods, but rather it started gathering around the people who spoke for them. At the center of this was Amun. Amun began as a local Theban god, but over time he became one of Egypt's most important deities. Associated with the hidden and the unseen, his nature was flexible enough to absorb new meanings and new roles. And after Ahmose the First's victory over the Hyksos, Amun's importance grew even faster. He was linked with Ra, the sun god, becoming Amun-Ra, one of the chief gods of Egypt. And from that point on, Amun wasn't just important, he became central. His temple at Karnak grew into one of the largest and richest religious centers in the ancient world. Wealth, land, and influence, all of it began to flow toward the priesthood. And those priests weren't just religious figures anymore. They became an institution. By the time of Amenhotep III, the priests of Amun administered vast amounts of land, resources, and wealth. They weren't just serving the state, they were becoming a power within it. The pharaoh still wore the crown, but the system beneath him was no longer entirely his, because in ancient Egypt, religion wasn't separate from power, it was the system. And to challenge that system was to challenge everything that Egypt stood on, which is exactly what one man tried to do. Amenhotep IV took the throne in 1353 BCE. He ruled the way pharaohs always had, but that system was already shifting. By this point, the priests of Amun had become incredibly powerful, so much so that they were beginning to rival the authority of the pharaoh himself. And then, in the 5th year of his reign, everything began to change. Amenhotep IV didn't simply reform the system, he began to dismantle it. The cult of Amun was restricted and attacked. Traditional religious practices were pushed aside, and in their place, the king elevated a single god above all others, the Aten, which wasn't a new god, but one that had never held this kind of power. The Aten was the sun disk, visible, ever-present, and direct. The Aten was associated with light and life in a way that set it apart from the older temple cults, and that made it different. Amenhotep IV didn't just worship the Aten, he redefined his entire identity around it. He changed his name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for Aten, and with that, the shift became personal. At first, the old gods weren't completely erased, their worship still existed in the background, but that didn't last. As his reign went on, Akhenaten's reforms became far more aggressive. The worship of other gods was increasingly suppressed, temples were shut down, and Amun, the most powerful of them all, was directly targeted. This wasn't a transition, this was a complete replacement. Akhenaten then did something more drastic. He abandoned Thebes, which was the center of Amun's power, and built an entirely new capital from scratch, called Akhenaten, a city devoted to the Aten, a city designed around the sun itself. Here, everything changed. Worship wasn't hidden away in dark inner chambers anymore. It was out in the open. You didn't have to imagine the presence of the god. You could see it and you could feel it, literally. But access to that god wasn't entirely equal, because in Akhenaten's world, there was only one real connection to the Aten himself and his queen Nefertiti. They weren't just rulers anymore, they became the central link between the divine and everyone else. If you wanted to reach that god, you had to go through them, and that changes everything. Even the art began to shift. You see, for centuries, Egyptian rulers had been shown as perfect, unchanging, and almost untouchable. But under Akhenaten, those images became something else entirely. The royal family is shown with elongated limbs, narrow faces, which were almost distorted looking, almost as if they were no longer fully human, as if they existed somewhere between man and God. It reinforces the idea that the new religion was built on, that they are different, that they're chosen, and that they stand alone. And whether he believed every word or not, his god did what Amun never could. It only answered to him. Akhenaten now ruled exactly how he wanted. He had broken away from the priests of Amun, elevated his own cult around the Aten, and built a city that revolved entirely around his god. For a moment, he had complete control. He had done what his father couldn't, but he didn't change just how things were done. He stepped outside of everything that defined the pharaoh before him. Over time, Akhenaten stopped acting like a traditional ruler. He no longer saw himself as just a king, or even as a bridge between the gods and the people. He saw himself as something more, the son of Aten, and eventually as the Aten's unique representative on earth, the Aten itself made flesh. And once you reach that point, everything else starts to feel beneath you. The responsibilities of ruling, foreign affairs, and the threats beyond Egypt's borders, all of that began to fade into the background. And we can see that in the diplomatic correspondence found at Amarna. According to the Amarna letters, foreign rulers were constantly asking Egypt for help, and Akhenaten appears slow to respond in some cases, and the system around him seems even less attentive than before, not because he couldn't, but because his focus had shifted on his city, his god, and his vision. And for a time, that was enough. He ruled for around 17 years to reshape religion, to challenge tradition, to change what it meant to worship the gods, or in this case, one god. For nearly 2 decades, everything in Egypt bent around that idea, but Egypt doesn't forget itself that easily. You can challenge the gods, you can tear down their temples, you can strip their names from stone, but thousands of years of tradition, of identity don't just disappear. They wait, and when the man at the center of all of it is gone, they return. After Akhenaten's death, the shift was immediate. His son, Tutankhaten, he changes his name to Tutankhamun. This wasn't just a simple name change, but rather a statement, a return to Amun, a return to what Egypt had always been. The temples were restored, the old gods returned, and the priesthood rose again. And everything Akhenaten built began to fade away. His city Akhenaten was left behind as if it never truly belonged in Egypt in the first place. Then comes Horemheb, and he doesn't just undo what Akhenaten started, he goes further. He removes the city completely. The city was dismantled in stages. The temples were either broken up or reused, the Aten was defaced, and Akhenaten himself was erased. His name was cut from the records, his monument was torn down or recycled, his memory was deliberately wiped from Egypt completely. But history has a way of resurfacing. The city he built didn't stay buried forever. The ruins of Akhenaten were eventually uncovered, and with them the story of the king who tried to change everything, a king who challenged the gods, and for a time he succeeded. Ancient Egyptian history is filled with powerful rulers, conquerors, and builders, but Akhenaten stands apart, not because of what he built, but because of what he tried to destroy. And in the end, even though Egypt tried to erase him, his story is the one that survived. Akhenaten's revolution didn't last, and the world he built disappeared almost as quickly as it came. On the surface, it looked like he failed, but what he attempted was something that few rulers would ever try to do. For a moment, he forced an entire civilization to see the world differently, to worship differently, and to believe differently. And that moment still matters because it shows how far one person can push against something that feels permanent. That's why Akhenaten still stands out, not because his world survived, but because he proved that it could be changed. Hi guys, thank you for taking out the time to watch the video. If you enjoyed the content, please like, comment, subscribe. Also, let me know if I missed out anything in the video. Alright, thank you guys.